The aura of a legendary warrior in ancient Three Kingdoms era China was known throughout the land. In modern digital media and interactive entertainment, a single name triggers an immediate tactical retreat. Lu Bu, pop culture portrayals and classic electronic simulations frame him not as a mere combatant, but as an elemental crisis on the battlefield. He is depicted as a towering figure, radiating an overwhelming presence that paralyzes opposing forces, sweeping through massive ranks of disciplined soldiers with a single strike, completely immune to the conventional rules of engagement. For decades, the myth has perpetuated a specific image, a lone warrior capable of shattering the morale of entire coalitions through raw and immense intimidation. In these theatrical representations, military strategy ceases to matter. The presence of Lu Bu alone shifts the balance of power. This is the legend of the apex combatant, a figure carved out of folklore to personify absolute battlefield dominance. To understand the collapse of the Han Dynasty, military historians must look past the theatricals and analyze the raw mechanics of ancient warfare. The historical reality of the man, the myth, the legend himself is preserved within the records of the Three Kingdoms, compiled by the historian Chen Shou. In these official administrative records, Lu Bu is stripped of supernatural attributes but remains an undeniable anomaly of physical leverage and genetic lottery. The texts officially dub him the Flying General, a title reserved for commanders possessing extraordinary mobility and lethal martial efficiency. Think of him as a massive version of Bruce Lee. From an intelligence perspective, his terrifying reputation was not born from magic, but from a precise combination of elite horse riding mastery, exceptional horse archery, and psychological warfare. He weaponized battlefield terror to induce immediate operational paralysis within enemy command structures before a single swing of his halberd. The reality of his combat supremacy relied heavily on the structural design of his weapon, the Ji. Far from a clunky fantasy axe, the historical Chinese halberd was a highly sophisticated, weight-optimized asset. It combined an armor-piercing spearhead for thrusting with a side crescent blade engineered for slashing and hooking. To put its efficiency into a modern perspective, the Ji functioned much like a massive 6-foot Swiss Army knife, with hooks on the back side, a multi-purpose tool engineered to counter multiple specialized threats simultaneously. This structural versatility allowed Lu Bu to dictate the terms of physical engagement with clinical precision. The records of the Three Kingdoms describe an official diplomatic standoff where Lu Bu averted an imminent war between rival warlord factions with a single astonishing display of marksmanship. He erected his Ji halberd at the gates of his camp and, from a distance of over 150 paces, loosed a single arrow that cleanly struck the tiny side crescent blade. It was a moment mirrored in modern cinematic storytelling, reminiscent of the iconic scene in the movie Troy, where Achilles completely neutralizes an impending mass conflict by executing a single, flawless, lightning-fast strike on a giant opponent. The historical chronicle notes that Lu Bu's individual combat style functioned as a form of asymmetric pressure. By operating at the absolute peak of human physical capacity, his movements on the battlefield were calculated to disrupt the defensive opposing lines. When the Flying General targeted a sector, it was an exercise in pure kinetic momentum, shifting the tides of an entire campaign not through mystical power, but through the surgical application of force and positioning. The sight of a single advancing rider was enough to shatter the tactical alignment of a defensive front. When Lu Bu appeared on the horizon, atop his legendary crimson mount, the Red Hare, it was described as an encounter with an unstoppable kinetic force. The myth portrays him charging headfirst into dense walls of pikes and shields entirely alone, a streak of absolute velocity cutting through iron formations. Witnesses in these tales describe the sound of his approach, the thundering rhythm of his mount echoing like an approaching thunderstorm. Then in an instant, his arrival physically tore through the vanguard lines. To the frontline soldier, seeing Lu Bu and the red hair closing the distance was a terrible omen of immediate, inevitable breakthrough. It was a spectacle of solo martial dominance that seemed to bypass the realities of mass military engagement. Lu Bu's true operational lethality relied not only on his overwhelming superhuman aura but highly coordinated vanguard mechanics. To execute deep penetrations into fortified lines, he utilized specialized heavy cavalry shock tactics engineered to maximize psychological pressure and cause instantaneous routing. The historical apparatus behind this frontline devastation was his elite vanguard unit, the Xianzhenying, or the Camp Crushers. These can be compared to modern-day Navy SEALs, the elite of the elite. Rather than scattered chaotic charges, this force operated under strict organizational discipline, targeting localized weak points in the enemy configuration. By combining intense, concentrated velocity with calculated positioning, Lu Bu did not merely fight individual soldiers. He triggered massive operational breakdowns, severing communication between enemy units and paralyzing the command structure before a comprehensive defense could be organized. The operational backbone of this elite vanguard system relied on a highly regimented command structure. According to the official historical chronicle, the Xianzhenying was limited to a precise elite roster of exactly 700 heavily equipped combatants. The recruiting process for this unit only picked the most elite of soldiers. Training was stringent, and the discipline instilled into this unit was like no other. This unit was under the absolute command of General Gao Xun, a military leader defined by immaculate personal integrity and unyielding professional standards. Gao Xun enforced a strict code of conduct that completely prohibited alcohol within the ranks and mandated that every piece of armor, weaponry, and equipment be meticulously maintained to flawless combat readiness. This extreme internal discipline transformed the unit into a highly reliable tactical asset. It operated with a level of mechanical precision that allowed them to consistently pierce opposing lines, a unit worthy of and keeping up with one and only Lu Bu. The strategic impact of this vanguard model transformed Lu Bu from a simple rogue combatant into a severe logistical crisis for opposing warlords. The specialized training of his heavy shock cavalry ensured that whenever a breach was formed, it was immediately exploited by disciplined supporting lines. By focusing on rapid, high-momentum penetration rather than prolonged attritional combat, the flying general systematically weaponized the natural panic mechanics of routing armies. This ensured that a shattered front line would inevitably cascade into the total collapse of the enemy's defensive integrity. While Lu Bu was the most feared warrior in the land, his politics were described very differently. The political views of Lu Bu are framed through a lens of absolute theatrical drama. He is frequently depicted as chaotic, unprincipled, and unhinged. Some described his actions as driven entirely by sudden impulses of greed and vanity, the true antagonist of any soldier's story. He betrayed his adoptive fathers like a villain in a tragic opera. The legends focus heavily on the personal drama, suggesting that a single woman or a chest of gold was enough to instantly change his entire stance on any given situation. In these narratives, his shifting allegiances are treated as erratic emotional outbursts, rather than calculated moves on a political chessboard. This perspective perpetuates the myth of a brilliant weapon that lacked any capacity for grand political strategy, a volatile element that ruined every alliance it touched purely out of localized self-interest. Looking past the later romanticized texts reveals a much colder reality based on regional warlord supply networks and survival logistics. To survive the rapid fragmentation of the Central Han Authority, military commanders were forced into constantly shifting alliances based entirely on resource acquisition and strategic positioning. When analyzing the operational collapse of Dongzhuo's regime from an internal intelligence perspective, Lu Bu's actions align with a calculated preservation of military leverage. The formal historical records indicate that the command structures he destroyed were already suffering from logistical paralysis and severe internal instability. His betrayals were not random acts of chaos, but tactical extractions from failing administrative systems to preserve his primary asset, himself and his elite vanguard unit. The way he schemed his extraction from Dong Zhuo's regime demonstrates a highly calculated intelligence operation rather than a sudden emotional stabbing. To ensure the complete neutralization of the ruling faction, Lu Bu coordinated directly with the Interior Minister, Wang Yun. This successfully secured the explicit backing of key Imperial Guard units stationed inside the capital. By executing Dong Zhuo from within his own inner sanctum, Lu Bu completely paralyzed the command and control structure of the massive Liang province army overnight. This precise surgical elimination effectively severed the head of the military. This began the plunging of their vast forces into immediate operational confusion and allowing Lu Bu to seize critical leverage before the regime's provincial garrisons could respond. By destabilizing the established chain of command at critical points, Lu Bu fundamentally altered the geometry of regional power. These strategic shifts were less about personal malice and more about the brutal reality of an independent warlord navigating a lawless landscape. Every betrayal remapped the military borders of the empire, proving that while his individual martial prowess was feared, his ability to instantly dissolve political alliances was an equally devastating weapon that kept his rivals in a state of constant worry. The grand campaigns of Lu Bu are celebrated as a series of effortless conquests dictated purely by raw intimidation and unmatched martial prowess. Warlords and regional governors are depicted as scattering in fear at the mere mention of his approach. They abandoned heavily fortified positions without a fight. The legends frame his territorial gains as immediate cinematic victories, where entire provinces fell under his control through the sheer terror of his frontline reputation. This narrative treats his battlefield movements as an unstoppable tide. It suggests that a warrior of his caliber could simply override the rules of territorial defense and regional fortification through absolute aggression alone. However, stripping away the folklore reveals that his peak military operation, the invasion of Yan province, was a masterclass in aggressive tactical exploitation rather than simple brute force. While Cao Cao was heavily committed to an external campaign in Shu province, Lu Bu launched a brilliant and lightning-fast strike into Cao Cao's unprotected home territory. Lu Bu's offensive was not a blind charge. It relied on the precise exploitation of local political unrest. Lu Bu coordinated with disaffected local elites who deeply resented Cao Cao's brutal regional policies. By securing immediate entry into key strategic centers, Lu Bu applied massive asymmetric pressure directly to Cao Cao's primary logistics and supply networks. This sudden advance forced the future King of Wei into a desperate, high-stakes strategic chess match. Lu Bu was disrupting his rear echelons, severing his communications, and pushing his entire faction to the absolute brink of total operational ruin. The critical turning point of this campaign exposed a fatal flaw in Lu Bu's overarching operational philosophy. Despite his brilliant tactical maneuvers and initial territorial dominance, he failed to secure the deep agricultural and economic infrastructure. This infrastructure was necessary to sustain a prolonged war. While Cao Cao possessed resilient defensive networks and could rely on structured internal logistics, Lu Bu's forces quickly exhausted their local stockpiles. As a devastating locust plague and regional famine swept the province, his army lacked the structured key supply lines to feed its mounts and men. The elite cavalry unit, led by the most elite warrior, soon began to starve. This inability to transition a brilliant vanguard assault into a stable and sustainable occupation ultimately forced a tactical retreat. Lu Bu was forced into relinquishing his strategic advantage and proving that a military machine fueled solely by kinetic momentum cannot survive when starved of foundational resources. The fragility of this initial triumph was exposed by the few critical strongholds that resisted his sudden onslaught. When Lu Bu executed his sweeping invasion of Yan province, Cao Cao's entire territorial network rapidly fractured and defected to his side. leaving only 3 isolated cities loyal to the future king of Wei: Huancheng, Dongjun, and Fangxian. These 3 stubborn holdouts became the center of a desperate and calculated defensive campaign orchestrated by Cao Cao's brilliant advisors, Xun Yu and Cao Ren. By maintaining an unbroken defensive posture, these advisors preserved a vital geographic anchor and a secure staging ground. This structural resilience ultimately bought enough time for Cao Cao to recall his main army and mount a devastating counteroffensive. The defensive brilliance of his officers led to demonstrating that Lu Bu's lightning-fast territorial seizures could still be paralyzed by a highly disciplined, deeply rooted defensive network. This fundamental economic vulnerability ultimately dictated the definitive collapse of his military career. The trajectory from his peak territorial pressure in Yan province to his final defeat at the siege of Xiapi highlights the hard reality that battlefield terror cannot overcome systemic resource depletion. Without a reliable, long-term logistical framework to replenish his elite vanguard forces, Lu Bu suffered from progressive operational paralysis caused by starvation. When encircled by superior, well-supplied coalitions, his brilliant tactical maneuvers were rendered irrelevant by slow and tactical attritional starvation. Quite ironic for the speed demon of China to be defeated by the slow brilliance of Cao Cao's strategists. This operational strangulation culminated in a brutal, multi-month siege at his final stronghold of Yapi, where his legendary martial prowess was completely neutralized without a grand battlefield clash. More on this final battle in a later video, The Final Battle of Yapi.